In October of 1896, workers demolishing an old warehouse in Louisville, Kentucky, broke through a brick wall and discovered a sealed iron box that had been hidden inside the structure for over half a century. Inside that box were 23 documents that would remain sealed by court order until 1968. A marriage certificate, dated March 17, 1841, bearing the signatures of Missouri Senator Philip Perry and a woman named Harriet Preston, along with letters, property deeds, baptismal records, and a detailed journal chronicling a relationship that violated every law designed to preserve racial hierarchy in the antebellum South. The marriage certificate itself was impossible. Missouri law in 1841 explicitly prohibited marriages between white persons and persons of African descent, with violators facing imprisonment and financial ruin. Senator Perry was one of Missouri's most prominent politicians, a lawyer, slave owner, and vocal defender of states' rights. Harriet Preston was legally classified as his property, purchased from a Virginia estate in 1838. Yet the certificate bore not only their signatures but also the seal of a minister and the witnessed signatures of 4 other people who'd risked everything to participate in a ceremony that could destroy them all. The documents in that iron box told a story that challenged everything 19th-century America claimed to believe about race, law, marriage, and the fundamental nature of slavery itself. They revealed a relationship that existed in impossible spaces, a love that violated every social boundary, and a scandal that nearly toppled one of Missouri's most powerful political families. What Senator Philip Perry did in 1841 wasn't just forbidden. According to the laws of his time and place, it was legally impossible, yet he did it anyway, and the consequences would echo through generations. Before we continue with the full story of Senator Perry and Harriet Preston, and the impossible marriage that defied every law of the antebellum South, make sure you hit that subscribe button because stories like this, stories buried in courthouse vaults and sealed by judicial order, are exactly what this channel uncovers. These are the histories that never made it into textbooks, the scandals that challenged the foundations of American society. Drop a comment below, telling me where you're watching from. Are you from Missouri, Kentucky? Does your hometown have secrets buried this deep in its past? Let me know. Now, let's travel back to St. Louis, Missouri, in the late 1830s, to understand how a respected senator came to risk everything for a relationship that the world around him insisted could not and should not exist. St. Louis, in 1839, stood at the crossroads of American expansion, a city caught between its French colonial past and its future as a gateway to Western territories. The population had exploded over the previous decade, growing from barely 5,000 souls in 1830 to nearly 17,000 by 1839. The city stretched along the Mississippi River's western bank, its commercial district crowded with warehouses, merchant houses, and the offices of lawyers and land speculators who made fortunes buying and selling property as the nation pushed westward. The riverfront itself was chaos incarnate. Steamboats arrived daily from New Orleans, Pittsburgh, and dozens of points between, their smokestacks blackening the sky, their steam whistles announcing arrivals that could be heard for miles across the flat Missouri landscape. Cargo piled on the docks in mountains of commercial goods. Cotton bales from the deep south, still smelling of the fields they came from. Furs from the northern territories wrapped in oilcloth bundles. Manufactured goods from eastern cities, packed in wooden crates, stamped with the names of Philadelphia and Boston merchants. And whiskey from Kentucky distilleries. Barrels stacked 5 high along the wharf. Teams of enslaved workers and free laborers, both white and black, loaded and unloaded this commerce, working from dawn until long after dark during peak seasons when the river ran high and trade moved fast. The smell of the river, thick with mud and sewage and rotting vegetation, mixed with smoke from the steamboat furnaces, and the perpetual dust kicked up by wagons hauling goods through unpaved streets, that turned to soup when it rained and baked hard as brick under the summer sun. The city's architecture reflected its transitional nature, old French colonial buildings, low stone structures with deep porches and shuttered windows, designed for the subtropical climate, stood alongside newer American buildings, taller brick structures that proclaimed ambition and modernity. The cathedral, constructed by French settlers decades earlier, dominated the riverfront, with its twin towers. But newer Protestant churches were rising throughout the city, marking the changing religious and cultural landscape. The old French families, proud Creoles who traced their ancestry back to the colonial era, watched this American invasion with mixed feelings. They needed American commerce and American money. But they resented American manners, American language, and American presumptions of cultural superiority. Street life in St. Louis was a constant negotiation between different populations who shared space without truly mixing. Wealthy merchants and their families occupied the better residential districts, building substantial homes that mimicked Eastern architectural styles. Professional men, lawyers and doctors and clerks, lived in boarding houses or modest rented rooms, saving money to establish themselves and waiting for opportunities to rise. Free black residents, a small but significant population in 1839, occupied a precarious middle ground, legally free but socially constrained by laws that limited their movement, their ability to gather, and their access to most occupations. They worked as barbers, washerwomen, draypersons, and skilled craftspeople, maintaining lives of careful respectability while navigating a legal system designed to limit their possibilities. And everywhere, woven through every aspect of the city's life, were enslaved people. Some hired out by their owners to work in shops or on the docks, others serving as domestic workers in the households of the wealthy, all of them existing in a state of legal non-existence that somehow made them central to everything the city accomplished. St. Louis in 1839 was overwhelmingly a city of young men, ambitious fortune seekers who'd come west to make names for themselves in law, commerce, or politics. Boarding houses and taverns outnumbered private homes in many districts. Violence was commonplace, settling disputes through fists or pistols rather than courts. Duels over matters of honor or business disputes happened frequently enough that newspapers barely bothered reporting them unless someone particularly prominent was involved. The city maintained a small police force, but enforcement of laws depended largely on who was breaking them and who was complaining about it. Justice in St. Louis, like everywhere else in America, was not blind but keenly aware of social position, race, and economic status. The economic engine driving St. Louis's growth was trade, but beneath that trade lay slavery. Every commercial transaction, every business deal, every accumulation of wealth, connected in some way to the institution of slavery. Cotton moved through St. Louis on its way to eastern mills, that cotton picked by enslaved workers. Hemp and tobacco, both slave-grown crops, provided much of Missouri's agricultural wealth. The steamboats themselves, those symbols of progress and American technological achievement, were built by enslaved workers in shipyards along the Ohio River, fueled with wood cut by enslaved labor, and often carried enslaved people as cargo, chained below deck and sold at journey's end. Missouri itself occupied a peculiar position in 1839. It had entered the Union in 1820 as a slave state under the Missouri Compromise, that famous political bargain that was supposed to settle the question of slavery's expansion, but instead only postponed the inevitable conflict. By 1839, Missouri had approximately 25,000 enslaved people, concentrated primarily in the river counties, where tobacco and hemp cultivation created demand for their labor. This was fewer than Deep South states like Alabama or Mississippi, where cotton cultivation created insatiable demand for enslaved labor, but significant enough to make slavery central to Missouri's economy and social structure. The state existed as a border region, neither fully Southern in its commitment to slavery nor Northern in its opposition to it. This ambiguity created tensions that manifested in politics, in social relations, and in the daily reality of how slavery functioned. The state's slave code was extensive and brutal, designed to maintain absolute control over the enslaved population while protecting the property rights of slave owners. Missouri law in 1839 defined enslaved people as property, subject to sale, inheritance, and seizure for debt like any other form of property. But the law also recognized, implicitly, that enslaved people were human beings capable of violence and resistance, which required elaborate legal structures to control their behavior. Enslaved people could not testify against white persons in court, eliminating any possibility of legal protection against abuse. They could not own property, not even small personal items like clothing or tools, As everything they possessed technically belonged to their owners, they could not learn to read or write. A prohibition designed to prevent them from forging travel passes, reading abolitionist literature, or acquiring knowledge that might make them question their condition. They could not travel without written permission from their owners, and any enslaved person found away from their owner's property without such permission faced immediate arrest and public whipping. The penalties for enslaved people who violated these restrictions were swift and severe. Public whipping was the standard punishment for most offenses, administered in courthouse squares where crowds gathered to witness the enforcement of racial hierarchy. More serious offenses, like attempted escape or violence against white people, brought hanging, sometimes after a perfunctory trial but often without any legal process at all. The system was designed to terrorize, to make clear through spectacular violence that resistance would be met with overwhelming force. Yet, despite this violence, despite the constant surveillance and the harsh punishments, enslaved people continued to resist in ways large and small, continued to create lives and families and communities within the spaces slavery's violence couldn't quite reach. The penalties for slave owners who violated the code's restrictions were less consistently enforced, creating a system where the powerful could bend rules that rigidly constrained the powerless. A slave owner could legally kill an enslaved person during the act of correction without facing murder charges, the law assuming that owners wouldn't destroy their own property without good reason. But a slave owner who freed an enslaved person without properly documenting the manumission faced fines and legal complications, because the state had an interest in maintaining the enslaved population and preventing the growth of a free black community that might inspire enslaved people to seek their own freedom. This asymmetry revealed the true purpose of the slave code: not to establish justice or maintain order, but to preserve white supremacy and protect slavery as an institution regardless of the human costs. One of St. Louis's most prominent citizens in 1839 was Philip Perry, 41 years old, serving his second term as United States Senator from Missouri. Perry came from Virginia originally, born in 1800 to a family of modest means, who'd nevertheless managed to secure him education at the College of William and Mary. He'd studied law, passed the bar in 1821, and immediately recognized that opportunity lay not in Virginia's crowded legal markets, but in the Western territories. He'd arrived in St. Louis in 1823 with $200, a trunk of law books, and a talent for making useful connections. By 1830, he owned a successful law practice, had married into one of St. Louis' French Creole families, served 3 terms in the Missouri state legislature, and accumulated enough political capital to win election to the United States Senate in 1836. His wife, Louise Marchant Perry, came from old money, her family's fortune built on fur trading connections that dated back to when St. Louis was still a French colonial outpost. The marriage, celebrated in 1828, was considered a perfect match. Louise brought social connections and financial resources. Philip brought ambition and political talent. They had 3 children by 1839, a daughter, Caroline, age 9, and 2 sons, Robert, age 7, and James, age 4. The family lived in a substantial brick house on Market Street, maintained by 6 enslaved workers, and moved in the highest circles of St. Louis society. Senator Perry's political positions aligned perfectly with Missouri's dominant interests in 1839. He supported states' rights, defended slavery as an institution protected by the Constitution, and argued forcefully against any federal interference with what he called the South's peculiar domestic arrangement. He was not a fanatic on the subject, not one of the fire-breathing defenders of slavery who dominated Deep South politics. Rather, he was what contemporaries called a moderate, someone who believed slavery was economically necessary, legally protected, and gradually dying out anyway, so agitation about it was unnecessary and dangerous. This moderation made him valuable in Washington, where Missouri's position as a border state gave its senators outsized influence in the delicate political balancing act that held the Union together. In the spring of 1838, Senator Perry purchased a young woman at a St. Louis slave auction. The transaction was recorded in the ledger of James Thornton, slave trader. Dated April 9, 1838. Female. Age estimated 18 years. From Virginia estate dispersal. Literate despite state laws. Skilled in household management and bookkeeping. Price $750. The unusually high price reflected the woman's education and skills, qualities that made her valuable for managing a household's accounts and correspondence, but also potentially dangerous. Literacy among enslaved people was illegal in Missouri, but slaves who'd been educated before arriving in the state existed in a legal gray area. Owners were forbidden from teaching them to read or write, but weren't required to ensure they forgot how. The woman was named Harriet Preston. The surname came from her previous owner in Virginia, the given name from her mother who died when Harriet was 12 years old. She stood about 5 feet 6 inches tall, unusual height for a woman of that era, with dark eyes that betrayed an intelligence her circumstances demanded she conceal. She'd been born in 1820 in Charlottesville, Virginia, on an estate owned by Alexander Preston, a tobacco planter who'd fallen on hard times as Virginia's soil exhausted itself and demand for Virginia tobacco declined in favor of Kentucky and Tennessee crops. Preston had educated several of his enslaved workers in the 1790s, before Virginia law made such education illegal, and had allowed those workers to teach their children despite the changing legal landscape. By the time Virginia tightened its laws in 1830, enforcing harsh penalties for teaching enslaved people to read, Harriet was already literate, already trained in household management, already aware of a world beyond the plantation that most enslaved people never glimpsed. When Alexander Preston died in 1837, his estate was sold to settle debts. Harriet, then 17 years old, was purchased by a slave trader who specialized in moving educated enslaved workers from the exhausted lands of Virginia and Maryland to the expanding markets of the Mississippi Valley. She spent 6 months in the trader's holding facility in Richmond, along with 30 other people being prepared for sale further south and west. In April of 1838, she stood on an auction block in St. Louis, while merchants and planters examined her as if she were livestock, checking her teeth, her hands, asking her to read passages from newspapers to verify her literacy. Senator Perry purchased Harriet with the intention of using her as household manager, someone who could supervise the other enslaved workers, manage household accounts, and handle correspondence. His wife Louise had never been interested in household management, preferring to spend her time on social obligations, shopping, and the constant round of teas, dinners, and parties that occupied St. Louis' elite class. The senator needed someone capable of ensuring his household ran smoothly without requiring constant oversight, and Harriet's education and skills made her uniquely valuable for this role. For the first year, the arrangement worked exactly as Senator Perry had intended. Harriet managed the household with quiet efficiency. She kept meticulous account books, supervised the other workers, ensured that the constant entertaining required by the senator's position happened smoothly, and remained nearly invisible in the way that enslaved workers were expected to be, present when needed, absent from notice when not. She was permitted to live in a small room in the main house rather than in the separate quarters behind the property, given access to the household library to verify accounts and manage correspondence, and granted a degree of autonomy unusual for someone in her position. The senator's wife regarded Harriet with the indifference typical of slave owners toward their property. As long as the household ran smoothly, as long as dinners were properly prepared, as long as the children were managed and social obligations were met, Louise Perry paid no attention to who actually made it all happen. She was often away from home, visiting relatives in other parts of the state, attending long social calls that could last days, or simply avoiding a house that felt increasingly like an obligation rather than a home. Senator Perry was frequently away as well, either in Washington during congressional sessions or traveling throughout Missouri when Congress wasn't in session, giving speeches, building political connections, doing the constant work that political life demanded. The household existed as a machine that ran itself, with Harriet quietly ensuring that all its parts functioned properly whether or not the owners were present. The relationship between Senator Perry and Harriet began to change in the winter of 1839. The senator had returned from Washington for the congressional recess, while Louise had traveled to New Orleans with the children to visit her sister, planning to be gone until spring. This left the senator and Harriet essentially alone in the house, along with the other enslaved workers who lived in the separate quarters behind the property. The household settled into a quiet rhythm, different from the constant social obligations that dominated when Louise was present. Without the need to entertain guests or maintain the performance of conventional domesticity, the house became simply a place where two people lived and worked. The senator had always treated Harriet with a degree of respect unusual for a slave owner. He addressed her directly rather than through intermediaries, asked for her opinions on household matters, and occasionally engaged her in conversation about topics beyond mere household management. These conversations began as discussions of accounts and expenses, but gradually expanded into other areas. The senator had a habit of thinking aloud, discussing political problems, talking through legal arguments, and Harriet, because she was educated, because she understood the references and could follow the logic, began to respond, not just with acknowledgement, but with insights of her own. One evening in early December of 1839, the senator was working in his study on a speech he was preparing about Western expansion and the question of whether new territories should be admitted as free or slave states. He was frustrated, unable to find the right words to express his argument that territories should decide for themselves, rather than having Congress impose a decision. Harriet entered to bring him coffee, and found him surrounded by crumpled papers, each one representing another failed attempt to articulate what he meant. Without thinking, she suggested a phrase from Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, a book she'd read years ago in Virginia when she'd had access to Alexander Preston's library. The spirit of moderation, she said quietly, should be that of the legislator. Good arising from the very nature of things is produced slowly, while evil arising from a contrary cause is produced rapidly. The senator stared at her for a long moment, surprised not just that she knew Montesquieu, but that she'd recognized how the argument could support his position, that gradual changes were preferable to rapid impositions. They talked for an hour that evening, discussing political philosophy, the nature of government, the tensions between federal power and state sovereignty. It was the first real conversation, the first time the senator had engaged with Harriet as something other than property, as someone whose thoughts and opinions had value independent of her function in managing his household. It would not be the last. Over the winter of 1839 to 1840, as Louise remained in New Orleans and the senator worked on various legal and political matters, these conversations became more frequent. The senator began to seek Harriet's opinions not just on household matters but on his work. He showed her drafts of speeches, asked her thoughts on legal arguments, discussed political strategies. He discovered that Harriet had read extensively during her time in Virginia, that her education went beyond basic literacy to include history, philosophy, and literature. She'd read Shakespeare and Milton, had studied Latin grammar, understood geometry and algebra. Her mind, shaped by years of reading and thinking, operated with a precision and insight that the senator found remarkable. Harriet responded with intelligence that challenged everything the senator believed about the racial hierarchy his entire life depended upon. She could discuss Locke's theories of government, could argue about Blackstone's commentaries on English law, could reference classical philosophers and modern political theorists. She demonstrated not just education but wisdom, a capacity for understanding complex ideas and seeing connections between different concepts that revealed genuine intellectual capability. For the senator, this was profoundly disturbing because it contradicted the fundamental justification for slavery. If enslaved people were capable of this level of thought, if they could engage with the same ideas as white intellectuals, if they demonstrated the same capacities for reason and reflection, then what possible justification could there be for treating them as property? The senator tried to rationalize what he was experiencing. He told himself that Harriet was exceptional, an unusual case that didn't disprove the general rule. He argued to himself that her education had come from white teachers, that she'd developed her intellect by absorbing white knowledge, that she was somehow an extension of white intellectual culture rather than proof of black intellectual capacity. But these rationalizations became harder to maintain as their conversations continued, as Harriet demonstrated not just the ability to repeat what she'd learned but to think independently, to form original arguments, to challenge the senator's assumptions, and make him reconsider positions he'd held for years. At some point during that winter, though neither could later identify exactly when, the nature of their relationship changed from master and slave to something else, something that had no name in their world, something that violated every law and custom, But that felt, to both of them, inevitable. The change didn't happen suddenly. There was no dramatic moment of decision or declaration. Instead, the relationship evolved through small moments, accumulated instances of connection that gradually transformed how they understood each other and themselves. A hand touching a hand while passing documents, the contact lasting a moment longer than necessary, conversations that lasted until late into the night, both of them finding excuses to continue talking even when everything that needed to be said had been said, a shared understanding that deepened with each interaction, a recognition that they'd somehow moved beyond the roles society assigned them into something more complicated and more real. They never spoke directly about this change in the beginning. To do so would require acknowledging what was happening, and acknowledgement would make it real in ways neither was ready to confront. The laws against miscegenation, the social taboos, the professional consequences, the potential violence, all of these things weighed against any explicit discussion of what was developing between them, so instead, they let it happen in silence, let it grow in the spaces between words, let it become real through actions rather than declarations. By February of 1840, they were lovers, though that word barely captured the complexity of their relationship. They shared not just physical intimacy but intellectual partnership, emotional connection, and a deepening sense that they'd found something in each other that neither had experienced before. What existed between Senator Philip Perry and Harriet Preston violated not just miscegenation laws but the fundamental logic of slavery itself. How could love exist between owner and owned? How could intimacy exist between free and enslaved? How could they create a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine connection, when the entire legal structure of their society insisted such a thing was impossible? Yet, it existed. They built something in the spaces between what the law said could be and what they felt must be. They created a private world that existed in defiance of the public world that surrounded them, and eventually, inevitably, they faced the question of what came next. In March of 1840, Louise Perry wrote from New Orleans, informing her husband that she'd decided to remain there permanently. The marriage, she wrote with surprising directness, had been a business arrangement that had served its purpose. Her family's money had launched his political career, his political connections had elevated their social status, and they'd produced 3 children to carry on both family lines. But she'd never loved him, had never wanted to live in St. Louis with its muddy streets and its crude frontier society, and now that she'd returned to the refined culture of New Orleans, she had no intention of coming back. She would keep the children, who preferred New Orleans anyway. He could keep the house, the enslaved workers, his political career, and whatever else he valued. She wanted only a formal separation agreement, and enough financial support to maintain her household in New Orleans. The senator received this letter with mixed emotions. Relief, certainly, because the marriage had been hollow for years. Guilt, because he knew his relationship with Harriet had made the marriage even more of a farce. But also a strange sense of possibility. If Louise was gone, if the social charade of their marriage was essentially over, what became possible? He discussed the letter with Harriet, something he would never have done in a conventional marriage, and found that she understood his conflicted feelings better than anyone else could. They talked late into the night about what they wanted, what was possible, what consequences they were willing to face. Harriet was under no illusions about the dangers of their relationship. She knew that if it became public knowledge, the senator would face social ostracism and likely political ruin. She knew that she could face sale to the Deep South, separation from the only man she'd ever loved, a future of hard labor and early death on some cotton plantation. She knew that the laws protecting slave owners applied only when those owners followed the unwritten rules of racial hierarchy. A white man could rape his slave with impunity, but a white man who genuinely loved his slave, who treated her as an equal, would face the full force of legal and social sanction. Yet, knowing all this, understanding the risks, she wanted something more than what they had. She wanted their relationship acknowledged in some way, even if only privately. She wanted some form of commitment that went beyond the emotional connection they'd already formed. The senator felt the same way. His entire life had been built on following rules, navigating political and social structures, making strategic decisions that advanced his interests. But with Harriet, he wanted something different. He wanted something real, something that mattered more than political calculation. In late March of 1840, Senator Perry made contact with a man named Jonathan Wells, a Methodist minister who served a small congregation in Alton, Illinois, just across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. Reverend Wells was known in certain circles as an abolitionist sympathizer, someone who believed slavery was a moral evil and who'd helped enslaved people escape to freedom more than once, though nothing had ever been proven. The senator traveled to Alton under the pretense of consulting with Illinois lawyers about a property matter. He met Reverend Wells in the minister's study, explained the situation with careful indirection, and asked whether the minister would be willing to perform a marriage ceremony. Reverend Wells listened to the senator's request with a mixture of admiration and horror. He was being asked to violate Missouri law, to create a legal document that could send everyone involved to prison, to participate in something that the senator's political colleagues would consider treason against the racial order. Yet he was also being asked to acknowledge the humanity of an enslaved woman, to validate a relationship built on genuine connection rather than power and violence. After several hours of conversation, Reverend Wells agreed, but with conditions. The ceremony would happen in Illinois, technically outside Missouri's jurisdiction, though everyone understood this was a legal fiction. The marriage certificate would be witnessed but kept secret, hidden away until some future time when society might be ready to acknowledge what had happened. And the senator would have to understand that this marriage, while valid in the eyes of God and perhaps in the eyes of Illinois law, would have no legal standing in Missouri. Harriet would remain legally enslaved. Their relationship would have to exist in shadows and secrets. On March 17, 1841, exactly 1 year after Louise Perry's letter ending their marriage, Senator Philip Perry and Harriet Preston crossed the Mississippi River to Alton, Illinois. They were accompanied by 4 people who'd agreed to serve as witnesses: Nathan Parker and his wife Susanna Miles, both free black residents of Alton who'd known Reverend Wells for years, and Simon Wallace and his wife Deborah Boyd, white abolitionists who ran a boarding house that served as a stop on the Underground Railroad. The ceremony took place in the basement of Reverend Wells's church at 10 o'clock in the morning. It lasted less than 20 minutes. Reverend Wells read from Scripture, asked the traditional questions, and pronounced Philip and Harriet husband and wife in the sight of God. They exchanged simple gold bands that the senator had purchased in St. Louis from a jeweler who thought they were intended as gifts for relatives. The witnesses signed the certificate. Reverend Wells affixed his seal, and the document was placed in an iron box for safekeeping. Philip and Harriet returned to St. Louis that evening as master and slave, their marriage a secret known only to 6 other people, their relationship unchanged in the eyes of the law but transformed in their own understanding. They couldn't live openly as husband and wife. They couldn't acknowledge their relationship publicly, but they'd created something that mattered to them, a commitment that went beyond the accidents of law and custom. For the next 3 years, Senator Perry and Harriet Preston maintained their impossible relationship in the shadows of St. Louis society. To the outside world, the senator was a respected widower, his wife having left him for New Orleans, his household managed by a capable enslaved woman. No one questioned this arrangement, because it was utterly conventional. Wealthy widowers often relied on enslaved workers to maintain their households. The senator entertained guests, hosted political dinners, traveled to Washington for congressional sessions, and maintained his political career. Harriet remained invisible in the way that enslaved workers were supposed to be, managing the household, supervising the other workers, ensuring everything functioned smoothly. But privately, behind closed doors when no visitors were present, they were husband and wife. They shared meals together, something that violated every social custom. They shared a bedroom, something that happened often enough in slave-holding households, but was never acknowledged. They talked late into the night about politics, philosophy, the news from Washington, the senator's work, books they'd read. They created a private world that existed in defiance of the public world. In December of 1841, Harriet discovered she was pregnant. This changed everything. A pregnancy could be hidden temporarily but not forever. A child would raise questions that couldn't easily be answered. The senator and Harriet faced a choice. They could end the pregnancy through methods that were illegal but available for those willing to pay. They could arrange for Harriet to give birth in secret and have the child taken away, a practice not uncommon in such situations, or they could have the child and face whatever consequences came. They chose to have the child. Harriet gave birth in June of 1842, attended by a free black midwife named Ruth Coleman, who was paid generously for her discretion. The birth was difficult. Harriet was in labor for nearly 20 hours, lost significant blood, and nearly died from fever. In the days following delivery, Ruth Coleman stayed at the house for 2 weeks, nursing Harriet back to health, while the senator canceled his travel plans and told political associates his household manager was ill. The baby, a daughter, was named Catherine after Harriet's grandmother. According to the legal reality of Missouri in 1842, Catherine was born enslaved. The law followed the condition of the mother. If the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved, regardless of who the father was. Senator Perry faced the grotesque legal reality that his own daughter was technically his property. This contradiction, which existed throughout the slave states, revealed the fundamental absurdity of the system. How could a man own his own child? Yet millions of enslaved people existed who shared blood with their owners, children and grandchildren of rape, or occasionally of relationships like Philip and Harriet's, all of them legally classified as property. The senator attempted to navigate this impossible situation through legal maneuvers. He drafted a will leaving everything he owned to Catherine. Using careful language that didn't specify her relationship to him, he created a trust fund managed by Jonathan Wells, the Illinois minister who'd married them, that would provide for Catherine's future. He explored options for taking Catherine to a free state where she could grow up free, but realized that removing her from St. Louis would require explanations he couldn't give. He considered manumission, legally freeing Catherine, but Missouri law required freed black people to leave the state within 6 months or face re-enslavement. Every option contained impossible contradictions. Meanwhile, Catherine grew. She was an active, intelligent child who looked remarkably like her father, with his light eyes and his sharp features. The few visitors who saw her assumed she was a child of one of the other enslaved workers, though some perhaps wondered about her appearance. The senator doted on her in private, teaching her to read when she was barely 4 years old, playing with her in ways that fathers did with their children, loving her in private while unable to acknowledge her publicly. The contradictions of Senator Perry's life grew increasingly untenable. Publicly, he remained a defender of slavery and states' rights, giving speeches in Congress arguing against federal interference with Southern institutions. Privately, he was married to an enslaved woman and trying to protect his enslaved daughter from a system he helped maintain. The cognitive dissonance required to navigate these contradictions took a psychological toll. He began drinking more heavily, sleeping poorly, withdrawing from social obligations. His political colleagues noticed the changes but attributed them to the stress of political life and his wife's abandonment. In 1843, Missouri passed stricter enforcement provisions in its slave code, responding to increasing reports of enslaved people escaping to Illinois and Iowa. The new laws increased penalties for anyone helping enslaved people escape and created financial incentives for informing on violators. The law's passage sent a clear message. The boundaries of acceptable behavior were narrowing, the space for ambiguity was shrinking. Senator Perry voted for the law's passage because voting against it would have raised questions about his loyalty to Southern interests. Then he went home and told Harriet that they needed to make plans for the worst. Through Reverend Wells in Alton, the senator made contact with the Underground Railroad network. He learned about routes north to Canada, about safe houses and conductors who guided escaped slaves to freedom. He transferred money to accounts in Illinois and Indiana that Harriet could access if she ever needed to flee. He gave her papers, carefully forged, identifying her as a free woman of color named Harriet Johnson, along with similar papers for Catherine. He told her that if anything happened to him, if their relationship was discovered, if danger came, she should take Catherine and run north, and not look back. Harriet accepted these preparations while knowing she'd never leave unless absolutely forced to. This was her home, such as it was. Philip was her husband, even if no one else could know it. Catherine deserved to know her father. She wouldn't abandon that unless survival demanded it. In the spring of 1844, Senator Perry's political enemies began circulating rumors. Nothing specific, nothing provable, just whispers that the senator had unusual household arrangements, that he was too familiar with his enslaved workers, that he'd been seen in Alton meeting with known abolitionists. These rumors were weapons in a political fight over Missouri's future. Perry represented the moderate faction that believed slavery was secure enough not to require constant agitation. His enemies, representing a more radical pro-slavery position, wanted to push him aside and replace him with someone who'd take a harder line. The rumors were intended to damage Perry's reputation and create doubt about his loyalty to Southern institutions. The senator recognized the danger immediately. He knew that any serious investigation of his household would reveal the truth. Catherine's parentage would become obvious to anyone who looked closely. Harriet's education and the way she managed the household would raise questions. The frequent trips to Alton would be examined. His entire life would be exposed as a lie, or worse, as a betrayal of everything his political career supposedly stood for. He consulted with political allies who advised him to marry again, quickly, to establish a conventional household that would end the rumors. He considered selling Harriet and Catherine, though the thought made him physically ill. He explored resigning from the Senate and moving with Harriet and Catherine to California or Oregon, territories where the past could potentially be escaped. But each option required abandoning either his family or his principles, and he couldn't bring himself to choose. The crisis came to a head in November of 1844. One of the senator's political enemies, a lawyer named Cyrus Stevens, arrived at the house unannounced, claiming to be investigating complaints about the senator's household management. Stevens demanded to see the household accounts, to interview the enslaved workers, to examine the arrangements. Senator Perry recognized this as an attempt to find evidence for the rumors, but he couldn't refuse without making the situation worse. He allowed Stevens access to the accounts but not to the workers, citing property rights and privacy. Stevens examined the account books that Harriet maintained, noted her handwriting and mathematical precision, and asked pointed questions about her education. Where had she learned to read and write? Who'd taught her? Was the senator aware that teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in Missouri? The senator explained that Harriet had been educated in Virginia before such education became illegal, that he'd purchased her already literate, that Missouri law didn't forbid enslaved people from maintaining skills they'd learned elsewhere. Stevens seemed unsatisfied but had no basis to press further. As Stevens was preparing to leave, Catherine, then 2 years old, ran into the room calling for her papa. The child went directly to the senator, who picked her up instinctively, naturally, the way a father picks up his daughter. Stevens watched this interaction with calculating interest. He noted Catherine's appearance, her resemblance to the senator, the easy affection between them. He asked casually about the child's parentage. The senator, his mind racing, claimed Catherine was the daughter of one of the other enslaved workers, not Harriet. Stevens nodded, said nothing more, and left. The senator knew, in that moment, that Stevens had seen the truth. Within days, more pointed rumors began circulating. Not just whispers about unusual household arrangements, but specific allegations. That Senator Perry had fathered a child with his slave. That he treated this child as his daughter. That he'd violated the racial boundaries that maintained social order. The rumors didn't include any mention of the secret marriage, but they didn't need to. The mere accusation that a senator had produced a child with his slave was enough to destroy a political career. Even though such situations were common throughout the slave states, the difference was that most white men who fathered children with enslaved women either ignored those children or sold them away. The allegation against Perry was that he'd acknowledged the child, treated her with affection, violated the fundamental rule that such relationships must never be acknowledged. Senator Perry consulted with Jonathan Wells, with Nathan Parker, with the few people who knew the full truth. They all gave the same advice: get Harriet and Catherine to safety immediately. The senator could weather the scandal if Harriet and Catherine disappeared. If there was no physical evidence of his transgression, he could claim the rumors were politically motivated lies, deny everything, and rely on his political connections to protect him. But if Harriet and Catherine remained in St. Louis, if investigators found them, if the truth came out, nothing could save him. The senator refused to send them away. He'd built his entire political career on compromise and calculation, but he couldn't compromise on this. He couldn't send his wife and daughter into exile to save his reputation. Instead, he made a different decision. On December 5, 1844, Senator Philip Perry stood before the Missouri state legislature and resigned his Senate seat, effective immediately. He gave no explanation beyond citing personal matters that required his full attention. His resignation shocked Missouri's political establishment. Senators didn't simply resign, especially not in the middle of their terms, especially not without explanation. The speculation was immediate and intense. Some claimed he was dying of illness. Others insisted he'd been forced out by scandal. Still others suggested he'd been bribed or blackmailed. The true reason remained unknown to all but a handful of people. After his resignation, Senator Perry liquidated his assets. He sold the Market Street house, sold most of his law books and furnishings, converted his property into cash and transferable securities. In January of 1845, he, Harriet, and Catherine boarded a steamboat heading south to New Orleans. From there, they took passage on a ship bound for Vera Cruz, Mexico. They traveled as Philip Johnson, his wife Harriet, and their daughter Catherine. The forged papers identifying Harriet as a free woman became their new reality. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829. As soon as they crossed the border, Harriet and Catherine were legally free, no longer subject to Missouri law or American racial codes. The iron box containing the marriage certificate and the other documents chronicling their relationship was left with Nathan Parker in Alton, with instructions to keep it sealed until everyone involved was dead. Senator Perry knew that the truth might be important someday, that historians might want to understand what had happened, but revealing it while anyone was still alive would only bring danger. The former senator and his family settled in a small town near Puebla, Mexico, where Philip established a modest law practice serving American expatriates and Mexican clients who needed assistance navigating international business law. They lived quietly, attracted little attention, and raised Catherine in a household where she could simply be their daughter without legal complications or social censure. The town, whose name appears in Philip's correspondence only as Pueblo de San Miguel, had a population of perhaps 2,000 people, mostly Mexican farmers and craftspeople, with a small community of American and European expatriates who'd come to Mexico for various reasons, some fleeing debt or scandal, others seeking opportunity in a country rebuilding after years of internal conflict. The Perry family, or the Johnson family as they were known in Mexico, rented a modest house on the edge of town, a Spanish colonial structure built around a central courtyard with thick adobe walls that kept the interior cool even during the hottest months. Philip converted one room into an office where he met with clients and prepared legal documents. Harriet managed the household, hired local women to help with cooking and cleaning, and taught Catherine to read and write in both English and Spanish. For the first time in her life, Harriet lived as a free woman, able to make decisions about her own time, her own activities, her own future. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. After years of living under constant surveillance and constant threat, she initially found it difficult to believe that she could simply walk through town without papers, could speak to anyone without permission, could make plans without needing approval from someone who owned her. It took months, perhaps years, for that ingrained caution to fade, for her to fully inhabit the freedom that Mexican law granted, but that her entire life experience had taught her to distrust. Philip's law practice grew slowly but steadily. American merchants doing business in Mexico needed someone who understood both American and Mexican law, who could draft contracts that would hold up in both jurisdictions, who could navigate the complex bureaucracy of Mexican customs and taxation. Philip provided these services competently and discreetly, never advertising his past, never mentioning that he'd once been a United States senator. His clients knew him simply as Philip Johnson, American lawyer, competent and reliable. Some probably suspected he was running from something. Most American expatriates in Mexico were, but they didn't ask, and he didn't tell. The unwritten rule among expatriates was that everyone's past was their own business, that Mexico offered a fresh start to those willing to accept it. Catherine grew up speaking both English and Spanish, comfortable in both American and Mexican culture, aware that her family was somehow different from their neighbors, but not fully understanding why until she was older. She attended a local convent school run by French nuns who educated girls from better families, learning, reading, writing, mathematics, and the religious instruction that Mexican culture considered essential for proper young women. She was a bright student, curious, and quick to learn, with her father's analytical mind and her mother's emotional intelligence. The nuns remarked on her unusual composure for a child, her ability to observe situations carefully before acting, qualities she'd perhaps inherited from parents who'd both spent years navigating dangerous social situations, where a single misstep could be catastrophic. When Catherine turned 10, in 1852, Philip finally told her the truth about their family's history. He explained that they'd lived in America, that he'd been a senator, that her mother had been enslaved, that their marriage was illegal under American law, that they'd fled to Mexico to build a life where their family could exist without constant danger. Catherine listened to this explanation with the same careful attention she brought to everything, processing information that fundamentally changed how she understood herself and her family. She asked intelligent questions about slavery, about American law, about why her parents had taken such risks. Philip and Harriet answered as honestly as they could, not hiding the reality of what slavery meant, not pretending that their relationship hadn't been shaped by profound inequality, but also not apologizing for choosing each other over the easier path of conforming to unjust laws. This conversation marked a transition in Catherine's understanding of herself. She began to recognize that her very existence challenged categories that American society insisted were fixed and immutable. She was the daughter of a white man and a black woman, categories that American law treated as absolutely separate and hierarchical. But she was also simply herself, a girl growing up in Mexico where those American categories mattered less. She began to understand that identity was more complicated than law allowed, that love could exist across boundaries that society insisted were uncrossable, that her parents' courage in defying those boundaries had given her a life that would have been impossible in America. They had 2 more children in Mexico, both sons, born in 1847 and 1850, Philip Jr. and Samuel, named for the father Philip had admired, and the biblical prophet Harriet's mother had revered. The boys grew up speaking primarily Spanish, more Mexican than American in their habits and outlook, comfortable in a culture that their parents had adopted out of necessity but that became their birthright. The family attended the local Catholic church, another adjustment for Philip who'd been raised Presbyterian and Harriet who'd been exposed to various Protestant denominations. Mexican society centered on Catholic ritual and observance, and the Perry Johnson family participated not from deep religious conviction but from social necessity and the genuine beauty they found in Catholic liturgy and community. Philip Perry died in 1863 at age 65, having never returned to the United States. His death came suddenly, a heart seizure while working in his office, surrounded by law books and client files. He'd built a quiet life in Mexico, far from the political ambitions of his youth, far from the compromises and hypocrisies that had defined his early career. In his final years, he wrote extensively in journals that his family preserved, reflecting on his choices, trying to understand how he'd become someone so different from the ambitious young lawyer who'd arrived in St. Louis 40 years earlier. These journals reveal a man wrestling with questions of morality and justice, trying to reconcile the beliefs he'd once held with the life he'd actually lived, attempting to understand whether his relationship with Harriet had been an act of courage or merely another form of exploitation dressed up as love. Harriet lived until 1879, dying at age 59 in the same house near Puebla, where they'd built their life together. She outlived Philip by 16 years, years she spent managing the household, helping her children establish their own lives, and maintaining the garden she'd cultivated behind the house, a small piece of earth that belonged to her in ways nothing had ever belonged to her in America. In her final years, she wrote her own reflections, letters to her children and grandchildren, explaining where she'd come from, what she'd endured, how she'd survived. These letters, preserved by her descendants, reveal a woman of remarkable strength and clarity, someone who understood the contradictions of her life, but refused to be defined by them. She wrote about slavery without flinching from its brutality, wrote about her relationship with Philip, without romanticizing the power imbalance that had shaped it, wrote about Mexico as both refuge and exile, a place that had given her freedom, but that could never fully replace the America that had denied her humanity. Catherine and her brothers buried their parents side by side in the town's cemetery, under headstones that identified them simply as Philip Johnson and Harriet Johnson, beloved parents. The graves exist still, tended by descendants who never knew the full story, marked with simple crosses that reveal nothing of the impossible journey that brought two people from St. Louis to a small town in Mexico, where they could finally live as husband and wife without fear. The secret of who they really were died with them, or so it seemed. The iron box containing the marriage certificate remained sealed in Nathan Parker's possession until his death in 1872. His widow, Susanna Miles, kept it until her own death in 1883. Their children, uncertain what to do with the box, eventually donated it to an abolitionist historical society in Illinois. The society's records indicated only that the box contained documents related to the Underground Railroad and should remain sealed until 1900. In 1896, the Historical Society moved its archives from Illinois to a warehouse in Louisville, Kentucky. During this move, the iron box, along with hundreds of other items, was placed in a section of the warehouse that was subsequently sealed off and forgotten. The warehouse was sold multiple times over the following years, and the sealed section became simply part of the building structure, its contents unknown. When workers demolishing the warehouse in October of 1896 broke through that sealed section and discovered the iron box, they had no idea what they'd found. They opened the box, saw old documents, and called a local historian to examine them. The historian, a man named Theodore Campbell, recognized immediately that he was looking at something extraordinary: a marriage certificate between a Missouri senator and an enslaved woman, letters discussing abolition and the Underground Railroad, property documents transferring ownership of enslaved people, a journal kept by someone named Harriet that chronicled a relationship spanning years. Theodore Campbell understood that these documents were politically explosive. 1896 was a time of increasing racial tension in America. The brief promise of Reconstruction had given way to the systematic disenfranchisement of Black Americans throughout the South. Jim Crow laws were spreading, lynching was increasing, and any suggestion that interracial relationships could be loving and legitimate was met with violent resistance. Campbell consulted with colleagues and legal advisors. They all agreed the documents should be preserved as historical evidence, but making them public in 1896 would serve no purpose except to inflame racial tensions. They petitioned a Kentucky judge to seal the documents by court order, arguing that they contained information that could damage the reputations of families still living. The judge agreed, issuing an order sealing the documents until 1968, a period of 72 years that would ensure everyone directly involved was long dead. When the documents were finally unsealed in 1968, America had changed dramatically from the nation that existed in 1841. The civil rights movement had challenged and partially dismantled the legal structure of segregation. Interracial marriage had been legal throughout the United States for only 1 year, since the Supreme Court's decision in Loving v. Virginia in 1967. The idea that a white man and a black woman could marry was no longer legally impossible, though it remained socially controversial in many parts of the country. Historians examining the documents in 1968 faced difficult questions about how to interpret them. Was this a love story, a tale of two people who defied unjust laws to be together, or was it more complicated than that, a relationship inevitably distorted by the power imbalance inherent in slavery? Could genuine love exist between owner and enslaved person, or did the fundamental inequality of their positions make any such relationship exploitative regardless of the feelings involved? These questions remain debated. What's undeniable is that Philip Perry and Harriet Preston created something that their society insisted was impossible. They married in defiance of law. They maintained a relationship that required constant secrecy and carried enormous risk. They had children together and raised them as best they could within impossible circumstances, and ultimately, they chose each other over everything else. Philip Perry gave up his Senate seat, his political career, his home, and his country, rather than send Harriet and Catherine into exile. That choice, documented in multiple sources, suggests depths of commitment that go beyond mere physical desire or exploitation. Harriet, for her part, chose to stay with Philip even when she had opportunities to escape to Canada with assistance from the Underground Railroad. She chose to maintain a relationship that kept her enslaved under Missouri law, that made her children technically property, that required her to live in constant fear of discovery. Her journal, preserved in the iron box, reveals a woman fully aware of the dangers and contradictions of her situation, yet committed to the relationship and the family she'd built with Philip. The question of how to judge such a relationship from the vantage point of the 21st century remains open. We can acknowledge the genuine affection and commitment, while also recognizing the fundamental injustice of a system that made one partner property. We can admire their courage in defying unjust laws while also questioning whether true equality was possible in such circumstances. We can recognize that their story reveals both the humanity that slavery tried to destroy and the lasting damage that slavery inflicted on every relationship it touched. Catherine, the daughter born of this impossible union, lived to 1907, dying at age 65 in Puebla, Mexico. She never returned to the United States, never claimed her father's American identity, never sought recognition for who she was. She raised her own family in Mexico, taught school, and lived a quiet life far from the country where her existence had been impossible. Her descendants, interviewed in the 1970s, after the documents became public, expressed mixed feelings about their ancestry. Some were proud that their great-great-grandfather had defied unjust laws. Others were uncomfortable with the relationship's foundation in slavery. All agreed that the story was complicated in ways that resisted simple moral judgment. The marriage certificate itself, the document at the center of this story, remains in the archives of the Kentucky Historical Society. It's a simple piece of paper, faded with age, bearing the signatures of Philip Perry and Harriet Preston along with the witnesses who risked their own safety to participate in an illegal ceremony. The certificate represents both the impossibility and the inevitability of what happened in 1841, a relationship that couldn't exist under law but did exist in reality, a marriage that was legally void but personally binding. Senator Philip Perry's legacy in Missouri history is complicated by this revelation. He's remembered in some accounts as a moderate voice, during a turbulent time, someone who tried to navigate between pro-slavery extremists and abolitionist agitators. In other accounts, he's dismissed as a hypocrite who defended slavery publicly, while privately violating its fundamental principles. Both views contain truth. Perry was a man of contradictions, someone who benefited from slavery while recognizing its fundamental injustice, who defended states' rights while personally defying state law. Perhaps the most accurate assessment is that he was a man who evolved, who began as a conventional defender of slavery and gradually, through his relationship with Harriet, came to recognize the humanity that slavery denied. His decision to resign from the Senate and leave the United States, rather than sacrifice his family, suggests a moral development that his earlier career didn't indicate. He chose love over power, family over reputation, and in doing so became someone different from the ambitious young senator who'd purchased Harriet at a St. Louis slave auction in 1838. The story of Senator Philip Perry and Harriet Preston forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about American history and the nature of moral judgment. Can we appreciate their courage without ignoring the system that made their relationship both necessary and dangerous? Can we acknowledge the genuine connection they formed, while also recognizing that the foundation of that connection was legal ownership? Can we judge them by the standards of their time without excusing the injustices of that time? These are not questions with easy answers, and perhaps that's appropriate. History is rarely as simple as we'd like it to be. People are complicated. Relationships are complicated, and the past contains more ambiguity than most textbooks acknowledge. The forbidden marriage of 1841 existed in spaces between law and reality, between public performance and private truth, between the world as it was supposed to be and the world as it actually was. That marriage, documented in an iron box and sealed away for generations, reminds us that love and commitment can exist, even in the most unjust circumstances, that people can choose connection over convenience, and that sometimes the most radical act is simply to insist on the humanity that society denies. If you've made it to the end of this story, you've journeyed through one of the most complex and morally ambiguous chapters in American history. This wasn't a simple tale of good versus evil, but a story of two people navigating impossible circumstances, making choices that we can judge but never fully understand unless we could walk in their shoes. Subscribe to this channel for more forgotten histories that challenge our assumptions about the past. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another story about the scandals, secrets, and hidden truths that shaped America. Share this video with someone who appreciates history that doesn't shy away from complexity and contradiction. And most importantly, let me know what you think in the comments below. Was this love or exploitation, courage or selfishness? Can we judge them fairly from our vantage point more than a century and a half later? Drop your thoughts below. I read every comment and I'm genuinely curious about how this story strikes you. The past is never as distant as we like to believe. The choices made in 1841 still echo through our world today.